Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. We are starting off season 9. I'm really excited for today's conversation. We are speaking with Dr. Arnold Berleant. He is the professor emeritus of philosophy at Long Island University and one of the most influential voices in contemporary aesthetics. Known for his pioneering work on environmental aesthetics and the concept of aesthetic engagement, Berleant has reshaped how we understand art, beauty, and the role of the observer. His work moves beyond traditional object-focused aesthetics and instead emphasizes the dynamic, participatory relationship between perceivers and their environment. Through decades of teaching, publishing, and international collaboration, Berleant has established himself as a central figure in aesthetics, aesthetic ethics, and the philosophy of the built environment. How are you doing today?
Very well, thank you.
I'm really excited. One point to make is because I am in Cusco, it is so hard to breathe here. So even as I was saying that, I had to take like 3 hard breaths. The elevation has been killing me, but it's gonna, I think maybe a few episodes in, I'll get that lung capacity to speak. But how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing well. And since I'm pretty much on sea level, I don't have the problem you do.
I mean, I am so excited for this season. I think beauty and aesthetic is something that came up so much in our previous season, which is why I was like, this is what we have to talk about. Our last season covered a lot of the topics around why educate at all? What is the purpose of continuing humanity forward? Is there a reason? Can we intellectually and rationally get there? And most people had this really vague answer of there is something about beauty and the experience of beauty that makes the human experience quite unique. And so I'm really excited to get into today's conversation, but I wanted to first start with how did you first find yourself in this space working with aesthetic?
Um, well, my first love was music. And I became enamored of music as a child, took piano lessons, gradually developed some degree of skill, and I attended a conservatory, a music conservatory, and got my bachelor's and master's degrees at the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York. Uh, and then my life course directed me into military service, which was compulsory at that time. So I left the university and went into the US Army, and I was stationed in Germany after I finished basic training. And that was a wonderful experience. It was my first experience abroad. And I found myself, I guess, comfortable, somehow comfortable in Europe. Uh, Although I didn't speak much German or much French. Um, when I got when I was discharged from the army after about 18 months, I began to study philosophy. I had become interested in it for some time before that, but I had begun reading while I was in the service, and then I decided I was able to go back to school through what was called the Korean GI Bill. And I went back and they said, this is my chance to study the humanities and philosophy in particular. So that's what I did. And I just followed my course as opportunities and inclination led. And I think I was fortunate in finding my own way. And I think your introduction was well done because it did pinpoint um, the focus of my work in philosophy. I became, of course, interested in aesthetics because of my musical background. But, but I had some experience uh, in appreciating the visual arts, and and I, in retrospect, I think I became sensitive to environmental experience without knowing that it was something of its own sort.
Mm.
Um, and I just went from point to point, so to speak, finding my way and making my way, so to speak, in a form, in a fashion that satisfied me, gradually forming my own ideas. And I'm at a point now where I published 9 books over my life, 9 books, and I would like to publish one final book, a little book with some key, excuse me, with some key essays in it. And those essays are, in some sense, the culmination of my development as a philosopher.
Mm. Are you working on it right now?
Well, I've written over the past couple of years. I've written three of them, and I think that's all I'm going to write. It's going to be a little book. I think there's advantage in having a little book. But one of the essays is called "The Aesthetics of Engagement," which is aesthetic engagement, which is a key idea of mine. Another essay is on landscape, which I've written about for decades.
Yeah.
And the third one is on environment, um, which I have just finished.
The, I mean, I think one of the really cool things about living, and I've been slowly feeling that as I'm getting older, is that for every year you get these very unique experiences and you slowly start building on them. And when you're a kid, you just haven't been around long enough to kind of, have experienced enough places, people, things to have this deeper understanding of the world. And so, I mean, it is absolutely fascinating. You started with music and then you went into the military and you found this love for reading through that. How do you feel like your time in the military shaped a lot of your philosophy since?
I don't think it shaped my philosophy. I think it was part of my life experience and coming across different kinds of people, uh, different kinds of American young men and European people, and just experiencing the world um, in new ways, and trying to accommodate all of this and into, as a philosopher, I try to put things together and make a coherent view. And of course, I think it's impossible to have a coherent view because there are too many loose ends floating around. But you're always trying to fit them together. And I'm at this stage in my life, which is very late. Uh, I'm pretty comfortable. I'm looking for a cough drop. Excuse me. Mm, Make one? No. I'll get one. Um, I'm at this stage in my life. I'm um, I'm 93 years old, and most people don't think I look that old. But I've I'm at the last stage of life, and I'm pretty comfortable with not happy with the world at all, but comfortable in the sense of having put things together in a way that I can understand somewhat. I was looking over your past record of podcasts, and you've talked to all kinds of people from all kinds of places, and, and so you must have some of the same challenge to put things together, put various things together. But and I'm reasonably comfortable with my understanding of philosophy and the capacities of human understanding,
Hmm.
and the and the nature of my experience.
Yeah. Do you feel, I mean, I have so many questions to ask because I think the first thing that comes to my mind is, do you feel like that process is something that is similar no matter what time period we live in, where or is do you feel like as generations pass forward, we're getting a deeper understanding of people? Or is it that we're just reaching the same form of understanding as people thousands of years ago?
Well, I can't speak for other people in other times, but I think this is a common quest that thoughtful people have always had. And, and if one is honest enough with oneself and persistent, I think it's likely that you can come to some provisional understanding that is that, that you feel comfortable with. Some people get it ready made, in a religion, in a philosophical system, in a political ideology. But for some of us, it's a personal quest and a personal achievement.
Hmm. Do you remember what that journey looked like when you were in your 20s? Did you ever feel like you would come to the place that you are today?
Well, I guess to be honest, I would say I hoped I would, but I had no idea what it would be like. And I'm not trying to come across as somebody who's answered all of his questions or is perfectly content. I'm not. I have lots of questions, and I know the world is a very rich and complicated condition for experience. But it's rewarding to be an explorer in this world, and I think you understand that. You're an explorer in your world. This is your way of exploring it. I think.
Yeah.
Um, so I found my way through music. I worked hard in music. I wrote some music. I practiced hard, but not that hard. I reached my limits as a musician quite early, recognizing that I could not be the performer I had dreamed of being or the composer I had dreamed of being, but recognizing that that was part of the quest, I guess, and it was an honest quest.
Yeah. I mean, life is just so fascinating and it's we were talking earlier about just my time in Machu Picchu and having that realization of how many other people have experienced this world before. we have. And I think that always takes me out of my own body and my own experience, just with that recognition of, oh, there are so many people who have had this experience. And I think I feel a deep sense of fear. And I think the reason I'm exploring so much now is because in my head, I think that if I can completely get a hold of uncertainty, then I can march into the last days of my life with a certain level of bravery. But I'm terrified, but I am struggling to find the peace to like make sense of kind of the chaos and the uncertainty of life. And it's and philosophy definitely gives me a kind of a walking stick in some sense. So, something to kind of hold on to make sense of some of the random things that happen. But sometimes it feels like, which is what I'm really excited to get into today, which is sometimes it feels like maybe this life is never meant to be understood, but maybe more to be experienced deeply and fully. And but I've been so much in my brain that I'm like afraid to live life more poetically rather than so rationally. Like rather than trying to understand something, simply just feeling the rain on my hands or reading a book and truly losing myself in the words rather than being like, what does this mean? What does this mean to my life? And balancing the desire for understanding with the desire to simply be, I think can be so challenging. How did you, as a philosopher and as an intellectual and as a musician, how did you balance those two, presence with the kind of desire to understand?
I think that's why I became a philosopher, um, because the desire to understand was the only way out of confusion. Um, and and there's all kinds of confusion. There's social confusion, there's political confusion, and there's personal confusion. We have a lot to we have a lot to make our way through. It's not easy. Um, but I think one of the things that I found, one of the kinds of experiences that I found most authentic was the experience of the in and through the arts. Just the the directness, the force, the unexpected connection um, with things. Um, and I, I visited a lot of museums, for example, art museums in many countries. And those are uh, endless sources of revelation. Uh, and but I never had a course in art appreciation, and I don't think I needed it. I know a little bit about the history of art, and one learns things from visiting, but I've experienced a lot. And I'll, maybe it helps to relate an incident that I had about 7 or 8 years ago. I was invited to give a lecture in Vienna, and I had problems traveling. In fact, that was the last trip I took anywhere because I my metabolic system must have changed, and I would get sick every time I went to a new place. Spend my first days in Paris in a hotel bed. It's not the way to travel. So I haven't traveled in about 8 years. But I was in Vienna. I was with my grandson, and we went to the Kunsthistorisches Museum, the Art History Museum, the great art museum in Vienna, which is one of the great museums in the world, art museums in the world. And I saw a painting there that uh, I had seen before because I had visited that museum many years earlier, and it was not a spectacular painting. It was a small portrait of an old man in a red gown, and it was by because it's called Portrait of an Old Man. It was by Tintoretto, and it was he was not an unusual looking man, and it was not a big impressive portrait. It was a small painting, and I looked at it, and he looked back at me, and I was hypnotized by the painting. I stood there and looked and looked and looked and con connected with it in a way that I was, as an experienced museum goer, I was not, still not expecting. It was, it was amazing how much richness there was in this basically simple portrait. Different portraits work in different ways. I particularly like portrait painting because I think it's interesting to look into the eyes of the person who's being painted. The eyes are key features. And if you look into Rembrandt's eyes in his self-portraits as an old man, you see the depth of the world. You see fantastic um, richness in those eyes. Uh, well, in any case, portraits are wonderful experiences of people. And this portrait, which again was such an ordinary looking painting that one could easily walk by it without even paying attention to it. But it it caught me, and I was very pleased. And I talk about it now because it's so significant. It was um, a minor thing in a major place, so to speak, but it became a major thing because of the way it worked with me.
Mm. The relationship to the piece.
What happened? Something happened. It was not just a painting on the wall. It was something happened. I'll
Mm.
give you some other examples to kind of illustrate the way things can happen with painting. I remember many years ago, much earlier, I visited a museum in a smaller American city, and there was a Rembrandt in that museum. And I thought to myself, every museum to be authentic has to have a Rembrandt. That's its badge of authenticity. And it was a Rembrandt, and it was a painting of just an ordinary guy, not a big painting. And I looked at it sort of with amusement and even with disdain. And then I moved out of that gallery, was walking out of the gallery, and before I got to the doorway, I glanced back at the painting, and it glanced back at me, and something had happened. The connection with that image was alive. So of course, I had to go back, look more closely, and I realized that what happens in the experience of painting is is a connection, a live exchange that goes on.
Mm.
Um, Now that's true, using an example of portrait painting, but it's true with all painting, and it's true with all art. It's true with music. It's true with in architecture, it's truth,
Yeah.
because it's it's our it's authentic connection. Maybe that's
Mm.
what the authentic connection that one can achieve.
I recently had an experience like this. I came across this painting called Death and the Maiden by Egon Schiele. I think that's how you pronounce his name.
Sheila,
Yeah, and I was moved. I mean, I have been looking at that painting probably every day since. Just there's something so simple but moving about that image that I can't. I've been reading this book recently called Martyr, and it has reinvigorated this like deep appreciation for poetry and art, and it is such a beautiful piece of work. But I think one thing I want to, so I grew up in the Bay Area, and I would say I grew up around a lot of people who work in tech. And even though I think coding is a deeply creative and aesthetic process, sometimes people may not see it that way, or their relationship with it may not be that way. One thing I wanted to ask was, what do you feel like art is? Because sometimes what I have noticed is when we think of art, people often immediately go to painting or drawing or music. There's a few things that come immediately to mind. But I think when you talk to the people who are most passionate about anything, they find the creative artistic elements of the thing itself, whether it's mathematics, whatever it is. And so is everything art, or is art an experience? What is art?
when you realize that that's a very enormous question, but an important one. The word art comes from the Latin, and it means it has to do with making. And in a sense, every kind of activity is is a making, is a doing, which is a making. So it has art is, to put it kind of poetically, it's living creatively. But I would put it more prosaically by saying we're always making, in a sense of doing things, making things happen. Um, we're we're being creative in the very way we fashion our movements in our time, and that's and the way we do it. If we do it with awareness and sensitivity, we're doing it in a manner of speaking like art. I use the word aesthetic. I would use the word aesthetically because aesthetics etymologically etymologically comes from sense perception, from the Greek word aesthesis, which means perception through the senses, and uh, and aesthetics has to do with sensory perception that is that is experienced directly. Uh, so for me, the aesthetic is fundamental. Um, you've read some philosophy, and so you maybe know about maybe you've heard the term first philosophy, referring to metaphysics, that which makes orders the world in the most basic way. Sometimes it's
Mhm.
called first first philosophy. Um, well, I think that aesthetics is first philosophy. It's the very ordering of experience, the very giving it, the very direct contact with the world in which we try to shape an understanding. So in that sense, it's a very philosophical activity. It's a metaphysical activity. It's forming reality, and that's what I think thoughtful people try to do. They try to understand the world, form, get a sense of reality of what the world is like. And I think philosophy is the formal study of this process.
Hmm. A lot of your work, as you mentioned earlier, talks about aesthetic engagement. And so I think that engagement part is a very key part of it. And I think part of that ties into maybe the art appreciation that you were talking about. But what is aesthetic engagement?
I'm very pleased that you located that term because it it's a key term for me. Um, I can best explain it by going at it backwards. The conventional way of thinking about the art appreciation is is to think of looking at a painting or a sculpture or something, contemplating it from a distance, standing back and looking at that painting out there on the wall or that sculpture apart from your body. And and the tradition of appreciation that that reflects is um, the conventional view of what art appreciation is, a kind of contemplative enjoyment of an object, but an enjoyment in which there's a separation between you and your appreciation and the object and its status in the world. There are two things, subject and object. And the, the classical ex, expression of that point of view is comes from Kant, who at the end of the 18th century wrote a still most influential book on aesthetics, which I think is badly mistaken, but it expresses this view that aesthetic appreciation is a disinterested contemplation of an object. Well, in my view, aesthetic experience is engagement. It's perceptual engagement, aesthetic engagement. It's not disinterested. It's interested. It's because you put yourself into it. You participate in it. You you become vulnerable because you're at stake yourself, so to speak, in this experience. You put yourself at stake. And that's so aesthetic engagement is the perceptual involvement, direct involvement,
Hmm.
and 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 when it takes positive form, we call that beauty.
Hmm. It's something
Beauty
that
does
comes to
not lie
mind.
in an object. It lies in the situation in which we experience something that is rewarding, that is positive.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, something that comes to mind is I hated literature growing up, and it was something I absolutely detested reading. And it was only after I left the classroom did I find a love for books. And the main reason for that was because growing up, it felt like there was a right answer. There was a definition for what a good book was, and there's a definition for what a bad book is. And then there is a right answer for why the author wrote it that way, and we already know the reason for that, and you have to basically regurgitate the answer that we all pretty much know already. And it led no space for what you're talking about, which is this personal experience for my own background and perception of the world to mingle and merge and kind of make a new meaning out of the book that might not be the same for somebody else. And I'm curious if one of the reasons it has become this way is do we treat the aesthetic sometimes as a hard science where there's like a right answer. There's a particular meaning that Dostoevsky was trying to say in Crime and Punishment. And therefore, where why can't it be left open to interpretation?
Well, it can be open to interpretation because what is interpretation but trying to make sense out of the experience in relation
Mm,
to a book or a painting, and that's where critics who are good critics can be of help, and our teachers can be of help. Uh, they can help us experience. And sometimes we don't understand something. We're missing something, not taking something into account. And by being reminded of this, the whole experience can change and become greater. So that's
yeah.
what a good teacher can do, what a good critic can do, what a good um, book can do.
I guess the next question would then be, is there something as quote unquote good art? Or is it just to the relationship for each individual person? Because I mean, I often think about this in a schooling setting because you pick a certain set of books. You say, these are the 10 books that are going to be in the curriculum. And by just setting that standard, you have in some way set these books to be quote unquote worthwhile of reading and the other books to not be for some odd reason. Do you feel like there is no such thing as good art, and it simply is just based on the depth of the perceiver?
It's both. Uh, it's not just one's response; it's one's experience with the art, with the object, with the music, with the landscape, with whatever it is. It's the joining of the two, or whatever is involved that creates the value. Um, but I'm not fully answering your question. You have to. You can't experience the whole world in an instant. It takes time, and you're never going to experience everything. You're never going to meet every person who's worth knowing. You're never going to visit every place that's worth seeing. You're never going to read every book that's worth reading. One should be sensitive to the things that one can experience and try to gain what one can from those, always within limitations, recognizing that we're living within limitations. We don't live forever, and our experience is of course limiting. But the thing about for me, the thing about aesthetics is that it's the disciplinary approach that opens us up to basic, the basic level of experience. And like as in that painting I was describing, the Tintoretto portrait, what was just an ordinary man's picture on a wall uh, became what some people would call a spiritual experience. I wouldn't use that term myself, but a meaningful, deep exchange because I brought something to it and it brought something to me. And
Hmm.
and that's how I think, and that's what the arts can teach us, and living aesthetically can teach us by opening us to, to experience fundamentally a sensory perceptual experience, direct experience, and recognizing it.
Yeah. So do you feel like aesthetic engagement You said earlier it can be taught by good teachers. What styles of teaching have you noticed to be effective in kind of developing this aesthetic engagement?
Mm. I, I really can't answer that question. I think what I've been talking to you about is what I would say to anybody in trying to explain and teach them. Uh, and that's the kind of that's the kind of teaching to get people to see, to get people to understand, to get people to be open to different aspects of their world. And that's what education is.
Hmm. I mean, it's interesting because I think for some people, I have some students who, from a very young age, just developed this deep sense of fascination for the world. And that fascination is very broad. It's for literature, it's for math, it's broad and it's something that I've absolutely been fascinated by. And I also have other students who, because of the schooling system, have developed a deep sense of distaste for anything that makes them feel like they're not competent or, they're not doing good enough. And I think one of the challenges, especially for example, in my elementary school, we had an amazing art program. We had like different people come and share art from around the world, and it was amazing. But they cut it all down. I mean, there is no more art classes and music classes and pottery, and all of that has stopped because people were like, well, this isn't going to help you get a job, so let's put the budget into, something else. Do you feel like what does it take to get people who don't see the world like that to actually value it? Because if you are to purely look at the world through a financial perspective and be like the only thing that matters is how much money you make, or I think it can be really hard to have these conversations. But there is something, it's only when you listen to someone who really finds that purpose and meaning through poetry and either writing or reading it, do you realize the kind of value in it. But if you're surrounded by no one who thinks like that, you would think somebody, and I really felt this a lot growing up in the Bay, you would think anyone who does do that is kind of crazy, or well, why would they spend their time doing that? They could be quote unquote more productive. How do you kind of navigate? It feels like the world is moving towards that direction to inculcate this kind of these conversations about aesthetic appreciation and engagement.
Well, if I could answer that question, I could transform the world. Uh, all I can say is that people who are not sensitive to these things um, are not fully alive, and they just they can't understand what they what they what they can't what they can't experience. I don't I don't know. And that there's something called aesthetic education, which is trying to inculcate this sensitivity, uh, and I think that's something that isn't talked about very much and pursued very formally, but it's certainly at the heart of what the answer to your question.
Mm. It is absurd how much richer life becomes when you do develop this sense of appreciation. I recently started running a film club. I never watched movies. I grew up my whole life hearing that movies was a waste of time. And I met a few people along the way who really loved film. Like, I mean, they cry, they laugh. I mean, they really experience scenes and it profoundly shapes the way that they lead their lives and understand the world. And so we started a group together and I can't I can't even explain how much richer my experiences have been with movies because of that. And when I tell people, sometimes they start laughing. They're like, "You now you've figured out an intellect." Like my family or people who don't, it's a different world, but it's like you found an intellectual way to watch movies now. Like it's just like this is what you're doing, and it's hard to explain, I think, but it is, I think it connects back to something you were saying earlier, which I feel like in moments of deep uncertainty, when someone passes away and an accident happens, something that snaps you out of your normal mode of living in the world, those are the times where I feel like these art pieces have the most capacity to really penetrate a person's experience. But when, as you said earlier, when you have these really strict religious practices or something that you don't really need to experience the uncertainty and you just immediately jump to that for the answer, then you don't actually have that opening for something else to really touch you. And I think that's why leaving space for uncertainty probably allows for more interactions to, really change your life. Because all it takes is one poem. Once you read one poem that changes, you really feel, then after that, you can now start seeing that in every poem. And I've noticed that with so many things in my life where I was so emotionally closed off to these things. And all it took was one picture or one poem, and all of a sudden that entire universe opened itself up to me. And I think it is important, especially seeing the schools in the Bay and how they've changed over the last few decades, how to kind of keep hold of that, without before we lose it all, and education just becomes this kind of cold, disinterested training machine.
Humor. But how to do that, you need enlightened educators. And we don't encourage them, do we? Those in charge tend not to encourage them.
Yeah. In your research, because I think one of the really interesting things is oftentimes when we give like hey, this might be a good idea, it sometimes always ties back to the financial model. You somehow have to be like, if you do X, then either because they'll be happier or something, then eventually you'll get to Z financial gain. In your research, did you ever make that connection between by rising uh, aesthetic engagement, you could somehow make more money, or did you completely just avoid even trying to make that connection?
I never thought of it in financial terms at all. For me, it, it, it's been a quest for understanding and formulating. Um, I'll give you an example, a different kind of example, but which I would not like to discuss in detail, but I'll just mention it because I just finished a short essay on environment. And environment, of course, is been a hot topic for several decades now. But people never think about what they think clearly about what they understand by environment. Usually think of environment as the surroundings, but that assumes that you're here and the surroundings are there. If you're a fish in the sea, you can't separate yourself from your surroundings because you're in, bringing them in constantly. You're eating and you're breathing oxygen through the water, and I mean this is a constant exchange. So when we talk about the environment, I think this is absurd. The environment is not the environment, something out there. It's it's a whole context. We use the word complex in which we're engaged, um, and 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 uh, and so we don't have what's called a dualistic or binary relationship between me and my environment. But I'm an environmental participant.
Hmm.
one whole context in which I'm a part. So that for me just struck home so strongly since I've been working on it, and it, and and I've done so much of my work on environmental aesthetics that it finally became clear to me that the very concepts with which we're working are not clearly understood or properly understood.
Hmm. I guess something I'm really curious about is because you have done some work and spent a lot of time internationally. Do you feel, I've always been fascinated when I was at the Louvre and I saw the line for Mona Lisa. And it was pretty much just a quick get to the front of the line, turn around, take a picture, leave. But it's fascinating that in the same room, there are as many phenomenal paintings that have a lot of historical meaning as the Mona Lisa, but are completely ignored. And I find what I'm getting to is a lot of the fascination for Mona Lisa is one, its financial value, like how much the fact that it is a very, very expensive painting and it has this kind of there's a story behind it and it represents something when you socially share that you've been able to see it. But most of the art is never being experienced. And I have found this to happen in so many different facets of life now, where even beautiful architecture, I mean, people travel all over the world to just get a few pictures and leave. There is no actual engagement, there's no personal kind of transformation with the experience itself that often happens. But something I wonder is if it's even possible for aesthetic appreciation engagement to be cultivated in a capitalist or a money-oriented society. Because I think ask the desire to live deeply often isn't tied to there's no guarantee that if you live a richer, deeper life, you'll somehow make more money. You'll have a nicer house or you'll there's no guarantee of that, but your experience of the world will be richer. But you have to even value that to begin with. And so this is something I experience a lot because I work with a wide range of students, and parents have very different desires for their students. I have a few parents who really do want their kids to be who to love life, to feel passionate about things, to care. And I have other parents who just want their kids to go to good schools, get good jobs, and buy a big home. And so to explain to that parent, I want your kids to read poetry or this or that, wouldn't make sense unless they're like, how is this going to help him get into college? How is this going to help her get into college? So it's how is it, do you think it's even possible? Because you've been to other countries. Have you seen it work better under other economic models than perhaps in the States?
Um, I think some of the same motives can be parental motives can be found in many different countries, both the ones you favor and the ones you criticize. Um, but we're all subject to we're victims of our culture. We're victims of our circumstances. You don't choose the family you're born into. You don't choose the country you're born into. Um, you don't choose your native language, so to speak. Um, and we have to make our way through these conditions. I don't know. I mean, as a teacher, I gather you're a teacher too, aren't you?
Hmm.
As a teacher, you're trying to lead people on, lead them into a clearer, broader understanding. And that's what we try to do. That's what that's what's going on in this conversation. Um, and the fact that we live at a time when prosaic and commercial values seem to have taken over most of everything um, is is our is our our burden. We have to suffer it, but we have to see through it and beyond it and not be victimized by it. I'm appalled how every advantage of technology and of capacity for experience is co-opted by commercial interests so that the internet becomes a marketplace and people's yearning for experience becomes a travel industry. Um, and you can't, it's so hard to extract yourself from that. But being aware of it is the first step. And, and, uh, and we're all victims of it to some extent. We don't choose our parents. So we have to find a way, our own way. It's more of a challenge for some people than for others. But I think the ones that have found, and I suppose the people you interview are people who have found their own ways to a large extent, and it's gratifying. It's 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 its own reward.
Yeah. I mean, 100%. And I think that's why sometimes it can be an echo chamber because I think when you talk to academics who often find, study one thing their whole lives, they deeply care about what it is that they study and they know the ins and outs of it and they form this very deep relationship with knowledge and the world through that medium. But I think yeah, sometimes it's a small bubble, and there are a lot of people out there, I think, who struggle to find, especially a lot of people that I've been meeting in their 20s, struggle to really create a sense of meaning or passion in their lives. And it's often co-opted by, groups that have their own agenda. And I think that's why a lot of this stuff, it gives you autonomy. It gives you the power to make your own meaning. I think that is one of the most powerful things with aesthetic engagement is that it gives you regain some of the power of your own life. You don't need a group to tell you what is worthwhile and what isn't. You're able to
In
start.
touch with your own experience
Yes.
and your own direct experience. That's the great value of it.
Yeah. So how do you feel like your research has and all the work that you've done throughout your life has penetrated your own experience of the world?
Oh, it's made it richer, constantly richer. I look out my window and I see beauty. I see
Mm,
the unfurling of leaves. I see the shapes of trees and shadows. I did a podcast once in which I talked about shadows on the snow. For me, this was a revelation. You never, shadows are a negative. You look at the thing, not the shadow. You look at the object, not its shadow. So this was a tree near my house, and it's a beautiful big oak tree. And in the winter, it's bare of leaves, so that the limbs are all clearly outlined. And in the sun, when the sun is out, or even in the light, but it's more dramatic when the sun is out and there's snow on the ground, you get this tree on the ground. You get the branches and the outline, and it's beautiful. It's a just
mm,
it's a silhouette, so to speak, and um, and as the sun moves, the shadows moves too. So this is part of the experience of the world, right outside the window. And I
mm,
become sensitive to shadows ever since that revelation. Uh, Seeing how shadows are their own presence,
mm,
not just a negative thing. Uh, so life is a big discovery. It's a wonderful. It's a great opportunity for discovery, and it doesn't end. I can't say I've I've got it all in, but my life is constantly getting richer because of that. And as long as I'm not experiencing pain and I have the health to enjoy it, I'm pretty lucky.
Yeah.
But, but I don't have anything more than anybody else has, basically, in this capacity. You know, something I wrote about, I've talked about over the years, is the accessibility of aesthetic value, accessibility of aesthetic experience everywhere, not just in an art museum, but in your living room, in your bedroom, in your kitchen, uh, on your street. Uh, and there's a whole new movement in aesthetics called everyday aesthetics. That's
Mm.
that's developed out of this understanding. And I have a close colleague who travels the world giving lectures because it's such a popular theme for aesthetic conferences. She wrote a book on the aesthetics of the everyday, a couple of books, and 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 people are discovering the everyday aesthetics. It's right there in front of you.
Mm.
It's it's the it's the table on which you place your dinner service. It's the it's the ordering of chairs in your or seats in your living room. It's how you shape your experience. You're you're involved in making aesthetic decisions in all these cases. Um, so that idea that I didn't get that I can't claim inventing that idea completely. John Dewey wrote a book called Artist Experience, which is a very one of the most important books in aesthetics I've read. Artist Experience, and he talks about this sort of thing, that it's not an esoteric experience, but it's it's a direct, accessible one.
Mm.
And I've developed that idea, and so has my friend, my colleague. So this is a great revelation to a lot of people, everyday aesthetics, but it's
Yeah.
not new, but it's good. It's and to the extent that people see their world as having more aesthetic value,
Mm.
and it could be negative value. I talked a lot about negative aesthetic value. Uh, that's that's something too. Um, you can't. You got to. If you develop a sensitivity, you can be. You can. The sensitivity will allow you to experience pain as well as pleasure. And
Mm.
and there's such a thing as aesthetic pain.
Yeah. If you were to, I guess, from my own personal curiosity, if you were to go back to who you were in your 20s and you could give them a few, you could say anything. Is there a nugget of wisdom or uh, kind of a suggestion you'd say?
Oh, boy. I don't know. There's no magic phrase. There's what I would do is try to urge and maybe teach a 20-year-old to be to be aware of the world he or she lives in, sensitive to perception. How many people don't even look around them where they're sitting, don't even think about the way their room looks? Some people do, and so they're conscious of how they arrange their things. But uh, to be sensitive to the world is to be alive, and to be insensitive to it is to be dead. And there are a lot of walking dead. Try to get the 20-year-olds to be alive.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, thank you so much for this conversation. I feel like it was lovely. It is a phenomenal start to the season. Really understanding aesthetic appreciation and thinking, I guess, have opening the conversation about what is art, what is the relation. I mean, even talking about the daily aesthetic is something that is so important. It doesn't exist always in these really fancy sunsets. It sometimes is just in the, the after you make your tea and you see the kind of what's it called? Not the smoke, but the steam just rising. I think there are so many things just in your day to day that can be so beautiful. Actually, yesterday and I've been, I met a friend recently who has helped me see this more in my life recently as well. I saw these two people having a conversation yesterday over a pot of tea just outside, and there was butterflies just flying around them. And I just took some time to just sit and watch them. And I was like, this is so beautiful to see this particular small interaction just happening. And it made my day feel a little bit more connected and more beautiful. I felt like even though I wasn't there talking to them, I felt connected to them in some sense. And I think a lot of what you're saying is finding the beauty in everything around you and that it's there. It does not have to be in fancy Van Gogh paintings. It can be in the things that your child draws. It can be everywhere. And yeah.
All of aesthetic value, not beauty, because beauty tends to be too honorific. It makes it too important. But just
Hmm.
the way the steam rises from a cup of coffee is is can can be lovely. So it has aesthetic value. Uh, so it's a more conclusive concept, and that's what we want to do. We want to be more sensitive to the aesthetic value in all of our experience.
Hmm.
Tends to be often focused in the arts because that's the, the cultural institution that cultivates that value. But it's in many different contexts and it's everywhere. Um,
Yeah.
I think you seem to have understood my ideas very well, and I appreciate that. But I think you have a challenge because you've talked to so many different people, and you get the gist of their life's experience, so to speak, and you have to process it, and you have to connect it with all the other people you've talked to. It must be a challenge. But can you make your way through this richness? Um, that's that is a big challenge. I suspect you've learned how, or you're learning how.
Yeah. It's a long process, but I think when I talk to people like you, I feel a deep sense of faith in just trusting in the process. And I feel like I sometimes worry, I'm like, am I being ridiculous? Like, what am I doing? Like, why am I? But I think sometimes, yeah, faith is a very important piece, I think, of just not even in a God or anything, but just faith in yourself in the journey that things will not all fall on top of you. And even if it does, you'll have the courage and capacity to bravely get through it. Yeah, I've recently been just, I have been having a really tough time integrating the different experiences and conversations, and I'm just kind of stuck in a place of awe, but I have not integrated the narratives yet. But I think at this point in my life, I'm okay with that. But eventually, I think integration is an important piece as well.
You have a big challenge because you have such a broad range of things to account for. But that's good. That's breadth of experiences is a value in itself. And,
Yeah.
and
But
we
thank
have
you so much. I really appreciated this conversation and I
this is very
appreciated your
nice.
time. Thank you.
Okay, very nice. Well, you will edit this conversation, I suppose.
Yes, I will. Yeah, let me just hit this, stop recording.